Howdy y'all, welcome back to our self-sustaining ship tutorial. There's a lot of information to dig into this week, so let's just dive in. When dealing with large multi-piece self-sustaining ships, the first question you need to ask yourself during construction is, what type of drive do I want to use? There are a few configurations you can go with depending on what mods you may be using, but the two most prevalent are the standard drive and the puller drive. Standard drives are the simple configuration of putting a rocket down on the bottom. They tend to be slightly more efficient due to their construction necessitating less weight in the form of structural parts, but are detrimental to large rockets due to Newtonian physics. Allow me to explain. For every action, there is an equal but opposite reaction. As your engine fires, the exhaust gases push the craft forward. This pushing motion moves forward up and along the body of your craft. In a short or very rigid body design, this has little negative effect since it essentially is pushing straight up and then out into space. Any off-centered thrust is either negligible or is corrected for by SAS. However, in either long rockets, which have multiple heavy parts attached, or rockets assembled from docking ports, this pushing effect is magnified. As the force is pushed forward, the parts and the docking ports will flex because they aren't rigid. Again, following Newtonian physics, these pushing forces are now being exerted up the rocket, down the rocket, and potentially sideways. This effect creates a vibration in your craft that builds and builds until you stop firing the engines, or the rocket breaks apart due to the stress. SAS actually makes the problem worse, as in its attempt to correct the wobble caused by the vibration, it actually adds to the force, resulting in faster craft destruction. This is where a puller drive comes in. On long or heavy rockets, putting the drive at the front pushing downwards will direct all thrust down along the body of the craft, meaning that once again forces are only being exerted in one direction. While you can still get wobble this way, the craft acts more like a pendulum and naturally corrects itself over time. There is actually something in the real world called the pendulum rocket fallacy, which basically says everything I just said is false. However, this only applies when aerodynamic drag forces are concerned. In a vacuum, no other outside forces interfering with the rocket's motion, so the pendulum rocket fallacy doesn't apply. So then, when do you use a puller drive over a standard drive? If you're assembling a vessel that is more than two pieces, you have to use a puller drive. You'll just have too much flex from multiple docking ports, not to mention all the other pieces in between them. If your design is two pieces, that's where it gets iffy. I'd recommend one regardless to be safe, but it's definitely a necessity if your total weight is over 100 tons or if your total length is more than 40 meters. Outside of that, it's your choice. For a single-piece vessel design, you rarely need one. However, if you manage to launch a huge vessel to space in a single launch, it might be beneficial to you. Your mileage really will vary the most with this one design. After you've decided on your engine configuration, you need to decide which engine to actually use. Unless you simply hate it or haven't unlocked it yet, I'd recommend going with the Nerva nuclear engine. It's very heavy for its size, overheats easily, and has relatively low thrust, but with an ISP of 800, it's so efficient I couldn't imagine using any other engine for interplanetary travel. Doing this means a few things for your main drive section, however. First, you only need liquid fuel with the Nerva, meaning that the Mark 1, 2, and 3 aircraft pieces are going to be the most efficient for the drive module since you aren't wasting weight associated with oxidizer. However, there are benefits to using oxidizer fuel tanks as well. We'll get into that later though. Second, you'll need at least 2 engines to go anywhere, and 4 to go anywhere with any amount of speed. This means that your design must be symmetrical around the center of mass for the entire vehicle, not just the drive module itself. It doesn't have to be perfect. As we just said, puller drives are very stable and somewhat make up for any off-center design flaws. However, it does need to be close. Finally, the Nervas run hot, volcanically so you'll need a good cooling system. Before version 1.2, when parts got hot, you just had to turn them off and wait for them to cool down. Solar panels helped a bit since they dissipated heat better than other parts, but it wasn't enough for long burns from hot engines. Now though, we have a new heat system and new radiators. How the heating system works in-game is pretty in-depth and a somewhat convoluted subject. By now, I'm sure you've heard myself, Fritos, Biff, and others complain about heating bugs and ridiculous flash heating. However, your craft's heating while in flight is a bit simpler and easier to understand. First off, in order to see anything I'm talking about, hit Alt plus F12 to open the debug menu. Click on the Physics tab, then the Thermal tab. After that, check the box that says Display Thermal Data in Action Menu. Now when you right-click parts, you can see the temperature of that part as well as a lot of other information. There are also mods to do this, but surprisingly, I'm not aware of a mod that does it better than the debug menu option. I may explain all of this information in more detail in a future tutorial, but what matters the most to you is the skin temp and the conductive flux. Skin temp is the temperature of the outside of a part that you've right-clicked on, which is the measurement used to determine when parts explode due to overheating. Conductive flux is how much heat is passing through the part at any given moment. Parts with high conductive fluxes are able to dissipate heat much faster than those with lower conductive fluxes, because more heat can pass through them at any given moment in time. Conductive flux does rise as the temperature of a part rises, but eventually it will max out and the part will start to build up excess heat, resulting in the part exploding. This is where radiators come in. There are two types of radiators with 5 variations total in size. The first type is thermal control systems, which come in small, medium, and large sizes, and the second type are radiator panels, which come in small and large variants. Both do similar but different jobs. Radiator panels bolt on radially to a part and thus bleed heat directly off of that one part. They have high temperature thresholds but only average conductive flux. These radiator panels are good as either a secondary heat management system on large craft, such as self-sustaining ships, or as the primary heat management system on smaller craft and mining vehicles. For example, some jet engines can run hot at high speeds. Radiators bolted onto the parts closest to the jet engine will bleed off the extra heat and usually be enough to mitigate any overheating problems. We'll discuss their use on mining vehicles in more depth later on. It's also worth noting that one large panel is about as effective as 3 small panels. Thermal control systems are the fun one though. They are similar to solar panels in the sense that they unfold and turn to find the best angle to bleed heat. They have average temperature thresholds, but extremely high conductive flux. Even the smallest one, which is the size of the small collapsible solar panels, is enough to keep a standard rocket motor from overheating under harsh conditions because they dissipate heat so quickly. They also will draw heat away from the entire craft at once rather than just the part they are attached to, meaning that generally it's best to put them on a centralized location on your craft rather than just a hot part. The cooling effect is strongest though for parts closest to it, so with particularly hot parts like an engine, it would be beneficial to put them as close as possible. These should be your go-to cooling solutions for space stations and medium to large craft. It's also worth noting that they are quite fragile and somewhat inefficient in atmosphere, and should only be used in vacuum or on a stationary craft. When building a self-sustaining ship, it's good to use a combination of both. The engines get hot rather quickly, so radiator panels provide an extra bit of insurance against random explosions due to their high heat tolerance. The thermal control systems, meanwhile, are bleeding off all the generated heat. The closer you get to the sun, the more important all of this becomes as well, since your ambient temperature will rise as you absorb more of the sun's energy. Radiator panels are also invaluable during aerobraking as they can absorb the excess heat generated by the atmospheric friction. It will take more than a couple to survive aerobrakes at Eve, which has an extremely thick atmosphere, or Joule, which will have you intersecting it at speeds of around 10 kilometers per second. Still, these can be reusable alternatives to Biff's giant heat shield solution. Conversely, thermal control systems are mostly useless when aerobraking. They're more likely to break off due to the forces than bleed heat. It's best to fold them up when aerobraking anywhere, except maybe Duna. Its thin atmosphere tends to be fairly forgiving. Finally, concerning heat shields. While they are of little to no use on self-sustaining ships, they are the most efficient heat solution for single-use craft. In case you don't know, as they heat up, the outer hot layer burns off, revealing the inner cool layer. This process continues until it's all burnt off or cools down enough to stop burning up. These layers are known as ablation and make up the ablative resource in your resource panel. They have very low conductive flux as they're designed not to pass heat onto your craft, but do have a fairly high max temperature rating. Even after the ablation is completely gone, they can still provide enough heat resistance to make it through the last bit of an atmosphere, or in Biff's case, survive an aerobrake. They are one-shot deals though, and there currently is no way to replace them mid-flight. You never want to use a heat shield smaller than your craft, and shields larger than your craft provide more benefits than just more ablation. The larger shield will act like a huge air brake, slowing your craft down faster in the atmosphere, and will protect the sides of your craft from heating should you come down at a weird angle. This also serves to protect parts attached radially, as they still incur some friction heating because they stick out from the sides. So Biff, credit where credit's due, good job designing the Kerbal-Cast Aerobreaker. I think it's about time to wrap up this tutorial, seeing that I'm at the bottom of the 3rd page for my script, and I prefer to keep them closer to 2 pages. Next time we'll continue on with self-sustaining ships. We'll start off with fuel and ore loads, and who knows where we'll end up since I intended to cover that topic in this tutorial. Until next time, J. Arthur, signing off.